Chapter 5, Lesson 1. In this lesson, we're going to be analysing Beethoven's famous Fifth Symphony and taking an in-depth look at how he uses his very simple four-note cell to develop an entire orchestral piece. Throughout the rest of this chapter, we'll also be investigating some other examples that use very, very simple cells as the starting point for much larger orchestral pieces. So let's take a look at Beethoven's Symphony No. 5. Okay, so as you can hear, the cell starts out with a plain and simple statement in the strings and clarinet right from the get-go. All instruments are playing this cell together, all at the same time. It's then fragmented and split up amongst the different string instruments. Each of them take it in turns. The cell starts on a G in the second violins, but then the second fragment starts on an A flat. This is then handballed to the first violins at the top, who play the cell statement on an E flat. Then it moves to a G and then back to A flat again. So you can see that this cell starts as a big melodic statement, but then immediately it's fragmented and chopped up and passed around different string instruments. And each time it's almost like that fragment, that cell, has been cut and pasted onto a different starting note. Now, throughout the section in the middle, it uses the rhythm of the cell, but instead of having the cell in its original format with that noticeable gap, this original gap has been filled in with what we call passing notes. The first violins at the top fill in the gap in a descending motion, whilst the lower strings fill in the gap with an upward motion. This feels slightly different from our original cell, but it's still strongly linked. And when we listen to it, we notice that and we can go, oh yeah, that sounds like a variation on that original cell. The whole orchestra then plays this cell together in a big, loud statement, which I've put a box around. But this time we have two chords tacked on to the end of this original cell right there in the final two bars to help give this a bit of a musical exclamation mark. So each time this cell comes back, Beethoven is doing something slightly different. Let's take a listen to what this sounds like. Okay, now over the page here, again, you can hear another big statement of the cell by the entire orchestra at the very beginning of this page, but this time it uses different notes to the previous tutti statement. By the way, tutti is just a word we use to describe something that the entire orchestra is playing. Now, this big statement of the cell is again followed by more fragmentation amongst the string instruments. You'll notice some deviation from the original cell starts to happen here. The final note of the cell sometimes moves downwards and sometimes it moves upwards. So Beethoven is starting to play around with our expectation of the cell and fragmenting it, handballing it, and moving it around the orchestra and just changing those notes slightly each time. Now, the original cell was made up of 3 quavers followed by a longer held note, like this. But in this section, you can see that this rhythm has now changed. We now have 4 quavers in a row, and that last held note is no longer there. This creates the feeling that we're moving on to the next bar much quicker. It's building momentum. We still have those 3 repeated notes from the original cell, followed by a note that jumps. But the rhythm has now changed. That final note is not a long held note anymore. It's just another quaver. So although the rhythm has changed and it feels like we're moving faster, we can still identify that it's connected to that original cell idea. This cell is now moving around a lot more. It's not sticking to the original notes anymore. So it's almost like Beethoven is copying and pasting the cell to a different starting note in each bar and has changed the rhythm slightly to give it more momentum. So let's have a listen to what that sounds like. Here, it's almost like the cell takes on a rhythmic role and really focuses on those repeated notes Beethoven established on the previous page. Notice all the downward movement here. It almost feels like we are falling. It's a really tense moment. So he's using those quavers as an idea that he then comes back to and repeats, but this time he's using it to create this sense of falling. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like. Okay, cool, but then Beethoven does give us some relief from all of this movement and tension by having the original cell return, played by a solo French horn this time, which you can see inside that box there. This is a great example of how you can have your cell played by the entire orchestra 1 minute in a big thick texture, and then have it played by a solo instrument in a thin texture just moments later. This is also the first time we've really heard a brass instrument cut through as a noticeable orchestral colour. It's been very string heavy so far, so this draws our attention in. It kind of makes us feel like something different has happened, that there's been a change, but actually it's just a repetition of that original cell, just with a different orchestral colour. Now you may also notice that the French horn doesn't play the cell in its original format. The trademark 3 quavers followed by a long held note is there, but that gap is a lot larger this time, and it continues with another 2 notes on the end of the original cell. So it's almost like he's developing this cell into something that's a little bit more melodic now. Let's have a listen to what this sounds like. In the next section, Beethoven does what every good composer should do, and that's provide the listener with some contrast. He's probably thinking, okay, I've repeated that original cell heaps of times by now. I think everyone understands and can identify that that is my cell, so I should probably do something a little bit different for a while. And he does. He gives us this lovely little melody. But all the while, that cell is still there somewhere. It's now become the bass line, which you can see there at the bottom. Originally, the cell started with 3 quavers followed by a note that jumped downwards. But now, that final note jumps upwards instead. This helps add to the positivity of this section. It's more chirpy and happy sounding than what we've heard so far, so this slight variation on the original cell helps add to this more positive sounding section. But it's still recognizable, isn't it? By the way, when we swap the direction of the notes, so something that was originally moving downwards is now moving upwards, we call this inverting your cell, or a cell inversion. Let's take a listen to what this section sounds like. Even over the page, he keeps this bass line going, but towards the latter half of the page, some recognizable figures start to creep back in. We saw these cell variations earlier, so don't be afraid to bring back your developed cell ideas. You don't always have to bring back the cell in its original format. You can bring back a development of your cell. In the second half of this page, Beethoven uses this cell variation to build tension. Each time it's repeated, it moves up chromatically, which just means from one note to the next on the piano, so from white to black, black to white, white to black, etc. This helps lead the music towards a climactic moment. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like. Really hear it there in the bass line, in the bottom ends of the string section. Now on this page you can see this cell variation at work again, and then a return to that downwards quaver movement in the last 3 bars. Now although the notes no longer fit the original cell, the use of 4 quavers in a row was a cell variation established earlier. So this is now a familiar sounding passage that Beethoven has latched onto and has started to use and develop throughout the sections. So it feels close enough to that original cell for the listener to identify it as a variation of that cell, but it's still new enough that it's creating some kind of contrast as well. So let's have a listen to what this sounds like. And this idea continues to repeat over the page. On this page, Beethoven noticeably brings back that main cell, but it's almost like the cell is now happening in 2 different speeds. The woodwinds at the top of the page are playing those continuous quavers, those 4 quavers in a row, which has now been established as that sort of development of the cell. And he's essentially cutting and pasting the starting note of each cell for each new bar, which is giving it a lot of momentum. But all the while in the strings, the cell is stated, but then we have that extra long held note at the end of each of the cell statements. Now this is where I start to get really excited about cells. I love getting clever and starting to superimpose different variations of my cells on top of each other at the same time. This is really exciting, and this is what Beethoven is doing here. So let's take a listen. So hopefully by now you don't need me to tell you what's happening on this page. It's pretty obvious that the cell has returned in all its glory here. Let's have a listen. And over the page, Beethoven starts fragmenting this cell again. This is a trick we've seen a number of times now, where that cell is passed around or handballed from one instrument to another. John Williams actually uses this technique a lot in his film scoring. Now, this score goes on for 136 more pages. If we analyse the entire thing, we'd both go crazy. So I'm just going to flick through a couple of key moments to highlight other ways Beethoven has used this cell. Here he uses the same rhythm but makes the notes of the cell more melodic. You can see that in the woodwind section. Rather than just having them as repeated notes now, he's actually using those 3 quavers in a much more melodic way. Here, he uses the cell on a single repeated note. A tutti repeated note can sound very, very powerful, especially leading up to a climactic moment. So Beethoven built this entire orchestral piece using only 4 notes. When we first listen to this piece, it seems complicated and intricate, but once we know that the majority of his music is simply built around those 4 notes, it kind of demystifies it just a little bit. In the next lesson, we're going to take a look at how David Hirschfelder transformed his simple 4-note cell into the score for the film The Dressmaker. And we're also going to take a look at how James Horner transformed another simple 4-note cell into the score he wrote for the film A Beautiful Mind.